This is the first lab of the semester, the Anatomical Terms and Organ Systems lab. The way these labs are going to work is each one's going to have a video like the one you're watching now. And in the video, I'll walk you through all of the diagrams in each lab. You're then responsible for filling them in as we go, and afterwards answering the questions that are included in the lab. You'll then turn that completed worksheet in, and that's how you'll get your lab participation points. So let's scroll on down and start looking at our first diagram. So here we are looking at body regions. And up here we have a table of regions that we can use to fill in the diagram. You'll notice there are more regions up here in this table than there are in the diagrams. The lab manual was made for the in-person class, and so in lab we have models where we can see all of these different regions. For the online course, you are only responsible for the ones that show up in the diagrams. If they show up on a diagram, they're fair game for the lab exam. So up here, we are looking at the head. The head is the cephalic region. The eye is the orbital region. We'll learn that the orbital bone goes around the eye and makes the eye socket. The nose is the nasal region. The neck is the cervical region. That's a term we'll use a number of times through the semester. The armpit is the axillary region. The inside of the elbow, or what I like to unofficially call the elbow pit, is the antecubital region. Now remember, antecubital is the official, actual term. Elbow pit, as much as it might be fun to say, is not a correct answer, will not be accepted on an exam. Down here, we have the pelvic region. Down in the pelvis, the wrist is the carpal region. Think of carpal tunnel. This is the pubic region. This diagonal dashed line here, which is essentially the groin region, is called the inguinal region. Then all the way down at the bottom here with the ankle is the tarsal region. The wrist was carpal, the ankle is tarsal. Looking on the back side, here we're looking at the ear. The ear is the otic region. This line is pointing to the spine between the shoulder blades. Because it is the spine between the shoulder blades, it's the vertebral region. This is very, very close to the scapular region, which would be the shoulder blades. But this line is the vertebral region. The lower back here is the lumbar region. Think about lumbar support in a chair. The back of the knee, or the knee pit, is technically called the popliteal region. In the bottom of the foot is the plantar region. Think of plantar fasciitis or plantar warts. Our next diagram is dealing with directional terms. And directional terms are only used to describe the location of one thing compared to another. You can't just have something that is medial. It is medial compared to something else. And so you'll notice that these lines on this diagram come in pairs. And so each set of terms here comes in a pair. And so we have to figure out which pair goes with each set of lines on our diagram. So our first line here is referring to here versus this. So obviously this is up, this is down. But we don't use up versus down, because if a person was upside down, the head would be down. And so to avoid confusion, the head is always a certain direction, and away from the head is the other direction. And so For this one, we actually have two options of the pair that we can use. We can say this is cranial towards the head and caudal away from the head, or we can say superior and inferior. So cranial and superior, or inferior or caudal. This one is front versus back, but again, we don't use front or back. The front is technically the anterior side, and the back is the posterior. We can also use the terms ventral. Ventral is the front, and dorsal is the back. Think of the dorsal fin on something like a fish or a dolphin. Over here, this pair is referring to a limb or an appendage. On a limb or an appendage, we don't use terms like superior or inferior because it's so easy to move an arm or a leg up and down. So instead of that, we use the terms proximal and distal. Proximal is closest to the connection point, so the shoulder or the hip. So this is closer to the connection point than this point. So this is the proximal direction, and this is the distal region. The distal region is more distant from the connection point. So the elbow, we would say, is distal compared to the shoulder, but the elbow is proximal compared to the wrist. We use the same terms for the leg, and so this is proximal, and this is distal. These lines have a couple ways that we can interpret these. So when I look at this, I see it as pointing in and out. If that's the way we interpret this, then in is deep. Think of it going further deeper into the body, and out is superficial. Superficial is the surface, or towards the surface. If you look at it as this line going towards the center line, then this would be medial. This would be medial, and if you see this as pointing away from the center line, this would be lateral. Here we have some questions. You're responsible for answering and filling in those questions. Next we have body cavities. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order. I'm not going to follow the number order. I'm going to kind of start at the top and work our way down. So number 8 here is encompassing 6 and 7. Number 8, this area is the dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity includes the cranial cavity in the head and the vertebral cavity, number 7, which includes the spinal cord. Number 5 here, which includes all of these other, is the ventral cavity, and that includes number 1, the thoracic cavity, which is where your lungs and heart will be. It also includes number 4, the abdominopelvic region. And the abdominopelvic region is very self-explanatory because it includes the abdominal cavity, or the abdomen, and the pelvic or pelvis cavity down here at number 3. This is another diagram looking at the same cavities. So we learned that the head was the cranial cavity. The neck is the vertebral. This is one that was not on the previous one. So this was, on the previous diagram, included all in the thoracic cavity. But here we've broken it down into smaller subcavities. Number 3 is called the mediastinum. It's a cavity that's located above the heart and between the lungs. So these are the lungs. This is the pleural cavity. This is where the heart is located, number 5. This is called the pericardial cavity. Number 6 isn't actually a cavity. It is a muscle or a membrane that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. And number 6 is your diaphragm. We'll learn that the diaphragm not only is a divider, but it also is the muscle that helps you to breathe. Number 7 is pointing at this large region here, which is the abdomen. 8 is the pelvis. 9 includes the abdomen and the pelvis, and so it's the abdominal pelvic cavity. And number 10 includes everything other than 1 and 2. So this is the ventral cavity. This diagram is looking at the quadrants of the abdomen. So quadrants implies 4 regions. What we have here is we have the left upper, right lower, left lower. Upper and lower is easy enough, but you need to make sure you realize that the left and right refers to the patient's left and right. So when we're looking at this diagram, the left upper and left lower quadrant are on our right side. So looking at this diagram, what you're responsible for is knowing which organs are in which quadrant. And so if I ask you, name an organ that's located in the left upper quadrant, you could say spleen. Or if I said, what quadrant is the majority of the ascending colon in, you would have to tell me the right lower quadrant. So when you go through and look at that diagram here, you can fill it in this table here. Next, we have planes, or sections. So this is referring to ways that we can cut something. And so you can imagine if we took a patient or a model, or we use the same terms if we're talking about specimens or organs or slides, or anything like that. We can take it and we can cut it along the midline. If we cut something into left and right halves, it's called a sagittal plane. If it is right down the middle, cutting it into equal left and right halves, it's a mid-sagittal. If it's cutting in the left and right halves, but they're unequal, so it's off-center, that's a parasagittal plane. Here, we are cutting something into a front and a back piece. That is a frontal or coronal plane. Both terms are correct. To me, it's easier to remember frontal because you're cutting it into front and back. If you cut into top and bottom, this is called a transverse plane. Oblique is not shown here, but oblique is anything cut at a diagonal. Down here we have some questions that go along with those sections, so you'll need to answer those. On the last page we have a big table here asking you to fill in the organs and primary functions of the 11 organ systems. So when you're filling this out, you may run into, see it in your textbook, see it online somewhere, where they say that there are 12 organ systems. In this lab, we're considering male and female reproductive systems as one organ system, the reproductive system. So other places may separate those out from each other and say that there are 12. So you'll need to go through. This shouldn't be too hard. Information certainly in your book. And then once you fill that out, you can answer these questions. Once you've done that, you've finished your first lab. So make sure when Once you get it done, you turn it in. You need to turn it in to get your participation points, but make sure you keep a copy of it, certainly, because you're going to have to study it for the lab practical. If you have any questions about any of this, certainly send me a Canvas message. I'd be happy to help, and let me know if there's anything I can do to help you study for the lab exam. When you're ready, you can go ahead to the next lab.